Linda Stuart. I am the Director of Global Education Innovation at AFS International. I've been with the organization for just over 5 years. I am based in snowy Minneapolis, Minnesota in the US Midwest, actually, coincidentally, where Tara is also joining us from in a beautiful snowy Monday morning here. My role at AFS includes overseeing most of our digital education curriculum and virtual exchange. And I have also spent the last couple of weeks with my team curating this series of webinars for International Education Week. So just a little bit more about this week. It really is an opportunity to celebrate the benefits of international education and exchange around the world. We have several speakers that I would encourage you to go to our website at afs.org/IEW to check out some of the other events this week, ranging from assessment to virtual exchange, DE&I, and international and teacher education sessions. We also have a session later this US afternoon on Indigenous perspectives, looking at global citizenship through an Indigenous view. Briefly, a little bit about AFS. We were founded in 1914. We have over 70 years experience with intercultural programs and mobility, both in person and now virtual. We're currently operating in 55 countries. Well, there are 55 organizations operating in 113 countries. And on any given year, AFS can expect to have approximately 12,000 students on exchange around the world. We have 3 main impact goals, which are to develop active global citizens, globalize schools and institutions, and expand access to intercultural education. And with that, that brings us to our session today, where we are going to talk a little bit about how important it is to intentionally and effectively design and facilitate intercultural learning in mobility, again, in person and virtual exchange programs. And for that, we have invited Tara Harvey to come speak with you today. So I'm thinking that probably for most of you, Tara is not a new name, but she may be for some of you. And so I wanted to quickly here give a brief bio, but of course my computer, I'll be brief, Tara, and then you can of course share a little bit more. So for those of you that don't know Tara, I'm going to give you a little bit of history on her. She is a very highly regarded specialist in the intercultural teaching and higher ed education world. She is the founder of her own organization, True North Intercultural, where she combines her background on higher ed education and international exchange to deepen the understanding of intercultural teaching and learning. Prior to starting True North Intercultural, Tara taught English in Spain, and she worked as an international advisor at Texas A&M and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's also taught courses at the U of M in Minnesota, Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey, and was the academic director for intercultural learning for CIEE. She has several degrees and accolades from the University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Instituto Ortega y Gasset in Madrid, as well as a bachelor's in communication from Northwestern University. She is a qualified administrator of the IDI and is also a qualifying seminar instructor. And as I mentioned before, she is based here just down the way in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So we are very excited to have you with us here today, Tara, and learn so much from you about this topic of intentional and effective intercultural learning. So with that, I am going to turn the mouse over to you so you can run the slides yourself. Give me 1 second.
Thanks, Linda. While you do that, I'll share a little bit more about myself. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Tara Harvey. I don't want to repeat what Linda said, but I do think it's important to share a little bit with you so you understand the lenses that I'm bringing to the work and what I'm talking about today. So as Linda said, I am very focused on intercultural teaching and learning. The work I do now focuses on helping educators and mostly higher education institutions develop their own intercultural competence, but also think about how do we facilitate others' intercultural learning. But this interest started really as I got my career started in international education. So I've taught English abroad. I worked as an international student advisor and then worked in the study abroad field as well. And what I noticed is in education, we create a lot of experiences or opportunities for intercultural learning. You know, we're recruiting international students or students from other countries. We're recruiting for diversity on our campuses within our own countries. We're sending students abroad. And there's kind of an implicit assumption oftentimes that those experiences will help people develop the capacity to navigate cultural differences, to effectively bridge across differences. But I was noticing that that wasn't necessarily always happening as consistently or as broadly as we might like. And so I got very interested in really looking at, well, how do we ensure that these intercultural experiences that we're creating in education are as consistently and broadly leading to intercultural development as we would hope. That took me to do a PhD focused specifically on this question. The timing was right, that it just so happened that while I was pursuing my, let's see, Linda, I think I'm going to mute that second person there. As I was pursuing my PhD, it was really at a time in the early 2000s when we were starting to investigate more how to actively and intentionally facilitate intercultural learning. And the research was showing that just creating experiences wasn't enough, that we do indeed need to intentionally facilitate intercultural learning, and really finding that when we do intentionally facilitate intercultural learning, we have much more consistent intercultural development. And so I went on after my PhD, worked, as Linda said, for CIEE, the Council on International Educational Exchange. And there I was creating the intercultural curriculum for the study abroad programs around the world. But also, as we realized while we were doing this, more important than creating a great intercultural curriculum is the people that are facilitating that intercultural learning. They need to have the skills and understanding of how to facilitate intercultural learning, which is not an automatic knowledge or understanding that comes with intercultural experience necessarily. And so I was doing a lot of coaching and training for our resident staff around the world to help them develop their own intercultural competence and develop the capacity to facilitate intercultural learning. So eventually in 2016, I went out on my own to offer that to other institutions to help educators around the world develop their own intercultural capacity, but also their capacity to facilitate intercultural learning. So that's a little bit more information so you understand where I'm coming from. All right. Oops. All right. Before we get started, I just want to let you know kind of what we'll be talking about today. I do want to set the stage first a bit, make sure that we're all on the same page when I use terms like intercultural competence, and understand why we're talking about intentionally facilitating intercultural development. Then we're going to engage in a little learning of our own. I don't just want to talk about intercultural pedagogy, but hopefully model it a little bit for you and have you engage in some intercultural learning yourself. Then I'll discuss something called a 4-phase developmental framework for intercultural learning. This is a framework that I use as an educator. I teach to other educators to help us think about how to develop our own and others' intercultural learning. And finally, we'll talk about 3 different intercultural pedagogies. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but 3 things that I think are really important to keep in mind when facilitating intercultural learning. The fact that it needs to be developmental and constructivist and what that means. We'll talk about the experiential learning cycle and how to balance challenge and support for our learners. So first of all, let's make sure we're all on the same page when we use the term intercultural competence. In order to do that, we need to understand or have a shared understanding of what culture is. And this is a term that is widely used and has many different ways of thinking about it. When we talk about intercultural learning or intercultural development, I want to be thinking specifically about culture as a learned set of shared interpretations about beliefs, values, norms, and social practices, which affect the behaviors of a relatively large group of people. So many of you have probably heard of the analogy or the metaphor of culture as an iceberg. There are aspects of culture that are very observable, like language, food, dance, etc. But then there's a much larger aspect of culture that is more hidden outside of our awareness. And that's the things we're talking about here: beliefs, values, norms, social practices. All of these influence the more observable aspects of culture, but oftentimes are taken for granted. We don't necessarily see them as part of our culture, but we see them as what's normal, what's right, etc. And I do want to emphasize that we talk about behaviors of a relatively large group of people. We are all part of many different groups that may impact our behaviors, our values, our norms, etc. So we're not just talking about nationality or ethnicity, but also socioeconomic status, gender, abilities, regions. All of these are different groups that might help form our values and beliefs. And so we're talking about all of those different things when we talk about culture. So intercultural competence is the ability to communicate and act appropriately, effectively, and authentically across cultural differences, both locally and globally. Effectively means, we're trying to do something and there's a diverse context and we want to be effective at accomplishing that goal. Appropriately means we do it in a way that really is respectful towards everyone involved. And then authentically, we're not compromising who we are. We're not adapting in a way that we're uncomfortable with, but we feel authentic in the way that we're navigating this difference. And I do want to go back and say one thing. I use the terms intercultural development, intercultural learning kind of synonymously to mean the development of intercultural competence. This is an ongoing process. It is not something that we have or we don't have, something to check off a list, but it's an ongoing, continuous process, as we'll discuss more today. And so next, let's turn to why is it important to intentionally facilitate intercultural development? I kind of hinted at this already in my intro, but do want to emphasize that we live in what's often referred to as a VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that's only increasing and has been highlighted in the last few years with COVID. And so all students need to be able to engage not only across differences, but also in this complex, uncertain world. And we've now found that exposure to, even immersion in other cultures, does not consistently lead to intercultural development. So it might lead to a lot of great things, but not necessarily that development of transferable intercultural competence skills. And so intentionally facilitating intercultural learning is important because that has been shown to be more effective than experience alone. So we need to combine intercultural experiences, whether they're abroad in persons in another country outside one's own, or at home. We need to combine that with intentionally facilitated intercultural learning. So let's dive into kind of a micro learning experience. So this is interactive. If you've been trying to multitask, come back. We're going to do a little exercise, and I encourage you to open up the chat if you don't have it open up yet. I'm going to ask you to count the number of triangles you see on the screen in a moment. I'll give you about 30 seconds to count them, And then when we're done, I'll ask you all to put your responses in the chat. So go ahead, 30 seconds, putting it on the clock, count the triangles. I see some responses coming in already in the chat. Another 5 seconds or so. All right, I've seen a lot of 26s, but also 25, 30, 49, 45, 43, 37, more than 26, 34, 37, 43, 29. Okay, so pretty simple exercise, and yet there's not consensus. It looks like we have some different thoughts on this. So we're gonna repeat this exercise, but with another image. So concentration again. I'm gonna give you a little bit less time this time. I'm gonna show you another image. Go ahead, count the triangles. And once you have, you can put your response in the chat. Ready? All right, I see responses coming in so far. 2, 7, 11, 0, none, 8, 8, 11, 0. All right, if you haven't got your response in yet, so far I'm seeing everything from, I think, 0 to 11. So again, we're all looking at the image, seeing very different things. Oh, I see a 12. All right, so I want you to think back to the days when you learned about a triangle, probably elementary school or before that. Think about your definition of a triangle. I don't know about the rest of you, but when I learned about triangles, I believe I learned it's a shape that has 3 sides and 3 angles. So technically speaking here, there are no triangles because there are no 3-sided images with 3 angles. So a lot of you put 0. A lot of you put 1 through 12, I think. So if you did see triangles here, or if you can see triangles, even if you answered 0, I'd encourage you to think about why you saw triangles here. And one thing I know is that our brains tend to fill in missing information. So if you saw triangles here, your brain was probably filling in the blanks, filling in the spots where there are discontinuous lines. But also, I primed you to see triangles. And what I mean by that is a moment ago, you saw a lot of actual complete triangles. And then I asked you the question, how many triangles do you see? So your brain was primed to see triangles and therefore more likely to fill in the blanks. And our brains actually do this oftentimes, not just with simple things like triangles, but our brain is regularly only taking in a limited amount of information and then filling in the blanks. So you may think that you see everything in front of you, but your eyes are actually only taking in a limited amount of information from what's in front of you. There's actually like basically a blind spot in our retina, but we don't notice that because it gets filled in between the information that comes in from our eye and our brain. And so I want to encourage you to think about the application of this to other areas of your life. Think about what are examples from your own life when you may be filling in the blanks, when you're filling in the blanks and seeing things that might not be there or that aren't fully there, but you see them nonetheless. All right, we're going to do one more little test or game, I should say. So you might want to take out a piece of paper, or you can just use your finger on the screen here. Some of you may have seen this, others may not have, but I want you to try to connect all 9 of these dots with 4 straight lines. So you have to draw 4 straight lines to connect all 9 dots without retracing any line or lifting your pen from the page. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to try that. And if you're able to do it, just put a yes or a done in the chat. And I see the question in the chat, what is the A in VUCA? A is ambiguity. All right, I see a couple people who say they've done this before. Even if you've done it, I would encourage you to try to do it again, because I've done it, and then sometimes I still have challenges doing it. All right, we've got a couple people who have done it. Carmen, I appreciate you, and others saying, I can't figure it out. Folks are trying. All right, so I'm going to offer one possibility here. So this is one possible way to connect all of these dots with 4 straight lines without lifting your pen from the page. It's difficult, Leroy said. Yeah. And I want you to think about why this might have been difficult for you, because now you see it on the screen. It probably looks rather simple, but you weren't able to come up with this, many of you. So I'd encourage you to think about, why could you not come up with this example? And a lot of people, I see Kenneth's response, I can do it with 3 lines. You just need three very long lines. So you might not think about doing long lines. You might not think about going past or outside of the box. So a lot of people tend to see these 9 dots and see a square, and automatically they limit themselves to literally staying inside that box. And so you might have made an assumption that you couldn't extend your line beyond the box. But if you did, you might not have even been aware that you were making that assumption. So oftentimes we are making assumptions that limit the way we see things, the choices that we have, and we're oftentimes not even aware of the assumptions that are limiting us. And so I encourage you to think of examples from your own life of a time when you realized you might have been making an assumption that was limiting you in what you see. This happens all of the time. I'll just give a brief example from my own life. I was speaking with a woman on Zoom who was interested in being in a program I run, but she mentioned that she would be on maternity leave during the next offering. So she wanted to be in the program the time after that. And towards the end of our call, I wished her a wonderful pregnancy, to which she responded, "I'm not pregnant." And I realized I had been making an assumption. I didn't even realize I was making an assumption, but I was assuming woman going on maternity leave, she is pregnant. When I know there are many different ways to bring a child into your life, but I was still making that assumption, and I wasn't even really aware that I was making that assumption. So I encourage you to think about times when you were making assumptions and you might not even realize that you were making those assumptions. And I want to introduce you to a quote from a book called The Art of Possibility by Zander and Zander. And this is not an intercultural book, but this particular saying has a lot to do with developing intercultural competence. So they suggest, ask yourself, what assumption am I making that I'm not aware I'm making that gives me what I see? And when you answer that, ask yourself, what might I now invent that I haven't yet invented that would give me other choices? So what we're doing here with the first stanza is really looking at how am I making meaning of the world? What assumptions am I making? And then the second part is about frame shifting. What could I invent now that would give me other choices, that would let me see other things that I might not be seeing yet? And so developing this capacity and the practice of doing this is part of developing our intercultural competence. And so I want to give you another opportunity, except for Kenneth. We know Kenneth can do this already, but everyone else, I want you to try to connect all 9 dots with 3 straight lines this time, without retracing any line or lifting your pen from the page. So again, I'll give you about 20 seconds. Go ahead, try to connect all 9 dots with 3 straight lines this time. And if you've done it, you can put just say yes or done in the chat. Allison's able to do it. Great. Andres, Sarita, Zena. All right. Got some people who are able to do this. Many of you probably still working on it. Leroy, I appreciate admitting that you need some help. All right, so here's one possibility. 3 straight lines connecting all 9 dots. Now, many of you did not come up with this response or this possibility. If you didn't, I would encourage you to think about, why didn't I come up with this? Many people make the assumption that you're supposed to go through, or you have to go through the middle of the line. But again, without even being aware that we're making this assumption. So when we think about developing intercultural competence, one of the things we want to really focus on is understanding that the meaning of events, or the meaning of the things around us, is not really in those events or in the things around us, but in us. We are making the meaning that we perceive in events and in the situations around us all the time. Others may be making meaning very differently. They may be seeing different things, interpreting it, perceiving it differently. When we can see that there are different ways of seeing or perceiving or framing an event, we have more choices and we can frame shift and see different perspectives. So Anais Nin, the novelist, says, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And here you see, a cute depiction of that in this cartoon with the rhinoceros painting the scenery with its horn in the middle of all of the paintings. So that's kind of a cute depiction of the fact that we don't actually see things as they are, we see things as we are. But sometimes when you think about intercultural situations or just engaging across difference, sometimes that can be less cute and funny and more problematic or challenging, as we see in this next cartoon, where we have a woman in a bikini and sunglasses looking at a woman in a burqa and thinking, everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. And the woman in the burqa looking at the woman in the bikini thinking, nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. So they're in the same experience, but they're having a different experience of one another. Or I should say they're having a similar experience of the other person, but for very different reasons. And so all of this just highlights the fact that, as Ethan Waters, a journalist, wrote, the most interesting thing about cultures may not be in the observable things they do, the rituals, eating preferences, codes of behavior, and the like, but in the way that they mold our most fundamental conscious and unconscious thinking and perception. So I want to introduce you to this 4-phase developmental framework for intercultural learning that provides a framework for thinking about what do we need to develop. When we talk about developing intercultural competence, what is it that we should be focusing on developing, whether that's for ourselves as educators or for our students? So this framework was originally developed by Dr. Michael or Mick Vandenberg, who's a close friend and mentor of mine. He originally conceptualized these 4, what we now call phases, as 4 competencies, but we've realized over time that they're not really separate competencies, but kind of phases that build on one another. And basically what this offers is a framework for what to focus on when thinking about developing intercultural competence. So the first phase is about everything we've just been talking about, increasing our awareness and understanding of our own characteristic ways of making meaning and acting in familiar and unfamiliar contexts. So starting to recognize when we're making assumptions, how we're making meaning, and then getting into how does our own background, experience, identities, how do these play a part in how we experience the world and how we make meaning of the world? So that's the first phase. The second phase is about increasing awareness and understanding of others' ways of making meaning and acting in familiar and unfamiliar contexts. We need to really understand that others are having a very different experience of the world, making sense of it differently because of their different background experiences, identities, and really deeply appreciate that their ways of making sense of things, of experiencing things, are equally valid and just as rich, but very different from our own. Phase 3 then involves responding mindfully in contexts that disorient or challenge us. It's not enough to just be aware of differences, but we need to learn to then slow down and respond in more mindful, intentional ways to those differences, rather than just reacting, which we're usually doing in socially and culturally conditioned ways without even realizing that we are doing that. And finally, the ultimate goal is to then bridge the cultural gaps in those contexts to be able to shift our perspective, attune our emotions, and adapt our behavior in effective and appropriate ways. And so here are those 4 phases together. In a moment, I'll talk to you about how they're interrelated. But what I want to highlight now is that these are not phases where you go through them 1, 2, 3, 4, now we're done. But this requires ongoing practice. All of these are things that we regularly need to be practicing and developing. And so if we think about the interrelationship of these phases, we want to start at the core here at the center. You see phases 1 and 2. If you're thinking about your own development, if you're thinking about your students' development, we need to focus first on understanding and becoming more aware of how we are making meaning of the world, and then how others may be making meaning of the world and experiencing things differently. And you see the green arrow in the middle going back and forth between these two because they're highly interrelated. As we come to better understand how I'm experiencing the world, how my experiences, background, identity impact how I make meaning, we can better appreciate, oh, people with different backgrounds and experience and identities may be making meaning of things very differently. Also, as we're exposed to more different ways of making meaning of the world and seeing things, we start to realize that we have taken for granted that our way of seeing and experiencing the world was, ubiquitous, that everyone else had a similar experience. And so these are at the core. We really need to start here, and then we can move out to developing more mindfulness practices of engaging more mindfully and eventually into bridging. So I want to talk now about a couple of pedagogies that can help us in developing these 4 phases. And I like to make sure that we're all on the same page again about what pedagogy means, or pedagogy, depending on where you are and how you say it. I love that the definition of this word is the art, the science, or the profession of teaching. And it is very much all of these things, as we'll talk about. So first of all, intercultural teaching and learning should be developmental and constructivist. And what we mean by this essentially is that we're helping learners develop more complex mindsets. It's not just about content, learning certain information, but really complexifying the way you see and experience the world and cultural differences and similarities. So being constructivist means that we're developing an understanding of how we each make meaning of the world. So going back to those 4 phases, we need to be focused on how we and others are making meaning of the world. That's the constructivist aspect of intercultural learning. And it's less about what you know as an educator and more about helping students draw learning from their own experience. So you can't tell a student how they're making meaning of the world. You need to help them start to understand that for themselves. And essentially, when we do that, we're helping students learn how to learn in the process so that they're not just learning from that particular experience, but they can take that forward to new experiences and learn from those experiences. And I see things coming through in the chat. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, but I'm not going to respond to those questions at the moment. So when we think about intercultural learning being developmental, essentially what this means is moving from more dualistic either or thinking through to more complex relativistic thinking, where we realize, other people are making meaning of the world differently. Our experiences are all relative. Then moving through to more metacognitive skills, where we can actually think about our thinking. So again, developing a more complex mindset. There are many different developmental models out there that all are about this same kind of movement into more complex thinking. Specifically, the intercultural development continuum is a model of developing a more complex mindset around cultural differences and similarity. Some of you might be familiar with the Intercultural Development Inventory, or IDI, which is an assessment that looks at development along this continuum. So I don't want to go into this model in much depth. It's a very complex model, but the key thing I want to emphasize is it's important to understand that this is a developmental experience of developing more complex mindsets, from more monocultural mindsets where we don't realize that we approach the world and make meaning of the world in a way that's developmentally and socially constructed. We just take for granted that others see and experience the world similarly to us, or they should, to more intercultural mindsets, where we're now understanding that we have a cultural lens, we see and experience the world a certain way, others may experience it differently. We can actually shift perspectives and see things from different points of view. We have more choices, can frame shift, and can actually bridge across those cultural differences. So as an educator, understanding this continuum is really helpful, because we know people don't jump from one place to another. They have to developmentally move through these different places on the continuum. And so as educators, we can think about, how do we meet people where they are and help them move along this continuum to the next place, and then adapt our teaching appropriately depending on where our learners are in the process. Next, I want to talk about the experiential learning cycle. So essentially what this is about is transforming experience into learning. David Kolb, who talks a lot about experiential learning, highlights the fact that learning is the process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience. So a lot of times when we hear the term experiential learning, we think this means learning through experience. But experiential learning actually highlights the fact that experience does not equate to learning. We actually have to transform experience into learning. And Kolb talks about a cycle for doing that. So you see his cycle here. At the top, we have concrete experience. That's doing or having an experience. But to actually learn deeply and fully from that experience, we have to go all the way around this cycle, not just have the experience. But we need to then do some reflective observation on that experience. So really just reflect on what happened. What did we experience? What were the feelings we had? And then move into abstract conceptualization, where you're making meaning or drawing learning out of the experience. And this happens through, reflecting, but then also connecting the experience to concepts, ideas, theories, to other experiences that you've had. So when we did the triangles and the dots earlier, I was asking you to make meaning on that, to connect it to your own personal experiences, to think about when have you made an assumption and weren't aware that you were making that assumption. And then once we've drawn out the meaning or the learning from the experience, we move into active experimentation, which means thinking about how you could utilize what you've learned moving forward, or how you could test it in a new experience. And that brings you back to having a concrete experience. And so one thing that David Kolb highlights is that there's this transformation line that oftentimes we don't get beyond. And I see this especially in international education. We create some sort of experience for folks, and then we encourage them to reflect. So oftentimes in study abroad, for example, we'll ask students to do some sort of journal, blog, vlog, and then we don't take it beyond that. And Kolb emphasizes that we really need to move all the way around the cycle in order to help people learn fully and deeply from experiences. And so I encourage you to think about, which of these areas am I focused on? Am I getting students beyond just reflecting on the experience and helping them make meaning from that experience, draw out learning from that experience, and think about how to apply that learning in the future or test it out in the future? So essentially, as educators, I like to think about our role as one of something between the sage on the stage and the guide on the side. The sage on the stage, you see in the image on the left here, the expert on the stage sharing their knowledge and expertise with others. That's not going to help others develop their own intercultural competence fully. The guide on the side role, as you see on the right here, is someone facilitating learning. The adult there cannot necessarily learn how to roller skate for the kid. The kid has to do it. They're the guide on the side. So I think of it as a balance. Hopefully we have expertise, we have knowledge about cultural differences, about these pedagogies that can help others learn, but they're still the ones that need to understand how they are making meaning of the world. They need to be the ones who do the bridging. And so we can think of ourselves like Mark Van Doren says in the quote on the bottom right here, the art of teaching is the art of assisting discovery. So our role as educators in facilitating intercultural learning is really helping others, assisting them in their own personal discovery. And finally, the last pedagogy I want to talk about today before we turn it over to Q&A is balancing challenge and support. So this is about helping learners move beyond their comfort zone. So there are a number of different theories that talk about how we need to balance challenge and support in order to optimize learning from experience. So I like to think of this as three concentric circles. We have the comfort zone, and we need to push ourselves beyond the comfort zone. So we need to challenge ourselves in order to get into our learning zone. However, one thing we oftentimes don't think about is that if we get too far outside our comfort zone, or we just spend too much time outside our comfort zone, we might go into what we're going to call the panic zone. Now, this doesn't mean you're having a panic attack or anything like that. But if you're too uncomfortable or uncomfortable for too long, you will shut off to learning. And so that is not optimal for learning either. And so what we want to think about is, how do we really get outside our comfort zone, but maximize the time in the learning zone and ensure we're not getting into the panic zone too often. So this is the optimal place where we want to be as much as possible, the learning zone, but we have to think about kind of dancing with discomfort in order to do that. So thinking about yourself or your learners, you might think about, how do we challenge people to get outside of their comfort zone? However, when we realize people are on the edge of that panic zone, we need to bring them back to the comfort zone. We need to provide support so that they're comfortable again, so that we can then push them outside of their comfort zone again. So it's really a balance. It's not just about being outside of your comfort zone all the time, but really, how do we balance challenging and supporting folks and ourselves so that we can maximize the time in that learning zone? And one thing I want to emphasize is that these zones are going to look very different for different people. And so part of the effort is really identifying what these different zones might look like for people. So how do you use these pedagogies? For one thing, when you're designing or facilitating any intercultural learning experiences, you can think about these pedagogies. Am I just focusing on experience, or are we making sure to design in and facilitate reflection, meaning making, active experimentation? Are we thinking about getting people outside of their comfort zone? How are we balancing challenge and support? You know, we might be doing a really challenging or talking about a very challenging content topic. Could we do that in a way that feels supportive, or in an environment that feels supportive? Just as an example, I was working with some faculty who mentioned that they took students to an area in India where the students experienced poverty in a way that they hadn't experienced it before. And it was obviously a very emotional experience for a lot of the students, and they weren't quite sure how to deal with it. Many of the students after that visit were asking if they could go to McDonald's. And the faculty, you know, were kind of wringing their hands like, what program have we created? Why are our students asking to go to McDonald's? But ultimately, they saw students' discomfort and ended up taking the students to McDonald's. And they said they actually had a really good conversation with students where they were able to reflect and make meaning of the experience because they were in what felt like a comfortable environment. And so they were supporting students by being in a comfortable environment while challenging them with difficult content, difficult ideas that they were grappling with. And so when they learned about this pedagogy, they saw what they were doing and why it was effective. You can also increase learners' awareness by empowering them with the knowledge of these theories, of these ideas. It doesn't just need to be about you as the educator doing this work, but you can also help students to really push themselves to learn more fully. And I'll give you an example with one activity that I've oftentimes used with students as well as with faculty that I've guided abroad. So essentially, I introduced them to what I just introduced you all to, this idea of the comfort zone, learning zone, panic zone, and the dance between the three. And I asked them to identify what each of these zones look like for them in the context of whatever program it is that we're working together in, whether that's a course, a program abroad, etc. So I want them to think about, what does the comfort zone look like for me? What does it mean to get outside my comfort zone to stretch? But what would put me in the panic zone? What would make me so uncomfortable that I shut down to learning again? And then I asked them to think about, how can each of the following help me get into the learning zone? The instructor, the facilitator, my peers in this program, and what can I do to get myself into the learning zone? And then we facilitate a conversation around this. And it's led to some really great conversations and more self-awareness and empowerment for students as they think about, how do I engage this intercultural learning experience? How do I want to engage it? And really, how can I support my peers as well in this learning process? All right. Let's see. So I think you'll all get access to the recording or to these slides, and you can check out the references if you like. I'll open it up for questions now, but one thing I want to highlight before I do is, if this is of interest to you, I have a lot more resources on my website. Specifically, I write a monthly blog about intercultural teaching and learning. And then I also host what's usually a monthly intercultural leadership forum. We gather for an hour every month. It's free. There's a different topic. It's not a training. It's not me talking so much as educators coming together with other interculturally minded educators, and we do small group facilitated discussion around a particular topic. So this coming one is December 15th, and the topic is bridging DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, and intercultural learning efforts. So if you're interested in exploring either of those resources or more, you can check out this website, truenorthintercultural.com/resources. Otherwise, I'll open it up for Q&A. I believe there's a Q&A area where you can put your questions in, and some of you may have already asked questions. So Linda, are there questions for us to respond to?
All right. That's a great question. Thank you so much, Kara. I just wanted to thank you again for everything you shared. And for those of you AFSers out there who are familiar with our global up programs, the Global Competence Certificate, I'm sure a lot of this was familiar, and that's very encouraging for us. It's encouraging for AFS to know that the intercultural curriculum that we put out there is based on these theories and the research that shows that this really is the transformational work. So I know I appreciated hearing the more in-depth descriptions of it, and seeing a lot of the pedagogies that we use incorporated in our curriculum in your work as well, Tara. So I think that's always very encouraging. Questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start out with one that came, and that is, maybe if you could just reflect for us, what are the differences that are present, or differences that you address for intercultural development when you have your faculty or your students in person versus when you're doing it in a virtual environment? Are there any differences that you've noticed, or any adaptations that you've had to make, and if you could share those with us?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's not so much about, what we're trying to develop, but the means for developing it. So I've been working online with faculty and staff in particular for the past several years, and have definitely iterated the way that I've done it over time. We're still focused on developing in all those different ways in those 4 phases I talked about. But one thing that I've definitely focused on is any sort of content delivery, doing that in asynchronous ways, and using live time that I have with folks, even if it's just online in a Zoom call, much more for the relational aspects, connecting people to other people, and then diving deeper into connecting the material and the content with personal experiences. So using any live time we have really for that facilitation of meaning making, understanding where others are coming from. That's how I've tried to use the live time, and balance kind of asynchronous and synchronous when online.
Perfect. Great. Thank you for that tip. Here's another question that came from our attendees. How do you balance power and privilege in developing intercultural competence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's part of the developing understanding and awareness of how we are making meaning and experiencing the world, and then how others may be making meaning of and experiencing the world very differently. I think all of that needs to involve the conversations around power and privilege and positionality. But an intercultural approach is developmental in meeting people where they are. So they might not be ready immediately to be thinking about their own power that they have in the world. They might need to first think about that they even have a cultural lens, that they're experiencing the world differently from other folks. So I think that's a definite conversation throughout all 4 of these phases, but particularly in 1 and 2, and then building on that in 3 and 4.
We'll just take a couple more. From Wenjun Tang said, thank you for this great presentation, Tara. You mentioned the phase after the reflection part. Could you talk a little bit more about how you would conduct that?
Yeah, so I think this is about the experiential learning cycle. We move from reflective observation into what's called abstract conceptualization, but it's really just about connecting the experience we have to other ideas and making meaning of it. So like you had the experience with the triangles, with the dots. That might not mean anything to you around intercultural learning until I encourage you to make that connection, to say, when are other times in your life when you might be making assumptions, for example? So that's where we're getting into the meaning making piece. We're saying, well, what does this mean? What is this experience? What can I learn from this experience? And then next, how would I take that forward? So I hope that makes more sense.
If you can do this in 30 seconds, how do you measure the impact of intercultural competence? So just what are you using for measurement?
I mean, there are a lot of different ways to assess intercultural learning. I love the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. ACNU also has a great rubric for intercultural learning, but it really depends on knowing what exactly your learning objectives are, and then how do you assess that. And I'm happy to stay on longer if anybody else has questions. I don't know if everybody has to get to another session or not.
Thank you so much, Tara. Great feedback. People have been really enjoying your presentation and all the expertise that you're bringing to the field. So I want to thank you for that. As Tara mentioned, she does have her website up, True Cultural. I can go back to it briefly. truenorthintercultural.com/resources. So go ahead and check out the materials there. We will be sending you a recording of this webinar in your inbox tomorrow, along with a brief survey. We always appreciate feedback as well, ways that we can improve. So take a minute to fill that out. And then lastly, I just wanted to put a shout out for the upcoming AFS Youth Assembly that will take place in August of 2023. So it's far enough ahead in the future, but there'll be enough time to plan. And so this is an annual event that AFS is hosting in New York for individuals between the ages of 18 and 32 years old. So if this is of interest for you personally, or possibly for students, if you're coming from institutions, I'd encourage you to go to the webpage youthassembly.org to check that out. And I think with that, that's everything. So we can stay on maybe for 1 more minute. I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but there are a lot of congratulations in the chat. So thank you all for joining us today, and please check out the rest of the remaining webinars for this week in honor of International Education Week. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.